He was just a kind-hearted man named Taye, who never imagined that saving a cat would change his life forever. Vivi, a wealthy young woman, would meet him by chance and sparks would fly. But not everyone was ready to see them together. Racism, prejudice, and betrayal would tear them apart, until fate stepped in. Watch this story of love, respect, and redemption unfold. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories like this. Taye had always lived a life of quiet dignity. Born into a middle-class family, he knew what it meant to work hard for everything he had. Money had never come easily, but he had integrity, ambition, and a heart that cared for others. He wasn't the kind of man to seek attention or praise. His actions were guided by a sense of right and wrong, by a desire to help whenever and wherever he could. Friends described him as dependable, compassionate, and calm, a man whose presence felt reassuring even in the most chaotic moments. He spent his mornings walking to work, passing through streets lined with trees that swayed gently in the wind. It was a routine that brought him peace, a chance to think and plan his day before the demands of work took over. On one such morning, as the sun cast a golden hue over the city, he heard a faint, distressed sound, soft mewing that barely carried over the sounds of passing traffic. He stopped, tilting his head to locate the source. High in the branches of a large oak tree, a small cat clung to the trunk, trembling with fear. Its tiny paws scraped against the bark, desperate for balance, desperate for safety. Taye's heart clenched. He had grown up with animals, learned early to treat them with care and respect. Without hesitation, he approached the tree, speaking softly to calm the frightened creature. Climbing the tree required patience and precision. Each step was measured, each movement deliberate, as he whispered gentle reassurances to the cat. Minutes felt like hours, but finally he reached the small animal, cradling it in his arms. The cat's body shook, but it was alive, unharmed, safe in his hands. Carefully, he descended the tree, placing the animal gently on solid ground. Vivi had been watching from the balcony of her family's luxurious home, worried and anxious. Her heart leapt when she saw Taye emerge from the tree, the cat safe in his arms. She rushed down the front steps, her voice filled with gratitude. "Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't saved him." Taye smiled modestly, shrugging lightly. "It was nothing. I just wanted to make sure he was safe." He returned the cat to her arms, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was something in that glance, a quiet understanding, a spark of curiosity that neither could ignore. Vivi, accustomed to people who were either impressed by her wealth or intimidated by her presence, felt a surprising sense of comfort with this man who had done something so simple, so genuine without expecting anything in return. Over the next few days, Vivi couldn't stop thinking about Taye. She found herself leaving small notes of thanks, offering to meet him for coffee, and gradually, these gestures turned into real conversations. Taye spoke with honesty and warmth, never boasting, never seeking to impress her with status or wealth. And yet, every word carried depth and sincerity, revealing a man of character who had seen the world, understood its injustices, and chosen to respond with compassion rather than anger. Vivi, in turn, began opening up. She told him about her sheltered upbringing, the loneliness she often felt despite her family's wealth, and her yearning for something real, something authentic that money couldn't buy. She laughed more freely around him, her guard slowly lowering as she discovered that he genuinely listened, genuinely cared. Their meetings became a quiet ritual. They explored small cafes tucked away in the city, strolled through parks with the kind of ease that only comes when two people feel safe with one another, and spent hours talking about life, dreams, and the future. Each encounter was a delicate weaving of friendship and subtle affection, a bond built on mutual respect and shared understanding. Taye admired Vivi's intelligence, her curiosity, and the kindness she showed to others despite the rigid expectations of her upbringing. He was careful, however, to maintain boundaries, aware of the social gap between them, yet he could not deny the growing connection he felt. He had always believed that relationships were built on character, not wealth or appearances, and Vivi's authenticity spoke to him in ways that few people ever had. Vivi, on the other hand, began to see life differently through Taye's eyes. She noticed the small things, the way he treated a barista with respect, how he helped strangers without hesitation, the quiet confidence that came from knowing who he was and what he stood for. She realized that his world, though simpler materially, was richer in ways she had never known. And she found herself drawn not just to his kindness, but to his strength, his principles, and the way he carried himself with dignity, even in the face of challenges. It was during one of these walks that Vivi asked him why he never seemed to complain, even when life was difficult. Taye thought for a moment before answering. Complaining doesn't solve anything. You act where you can, you stay true to yourself, and you let the rest follow its course. Life will throw challenges at you no matter what you do, but integrity is the one thing you can control. Vivi smiled, touched by his perspective. I think I've been so focused on what I want and expect from life that I've forgotten what matters. You remind me of that, she admitted softly. Their friendship grew, unspoken feelings blossoming beneath every laugh, every shared story, every moment of quiet connection. And yet, Taye knew that the outside world, especially her family, could never fully understand their bond. He sensed the barriers, the judgment, the assumptions that others would make based on what they saw on the surface. But neither he nor Vivi could stop the closeness that was forming, a closeness that would soon be tested in ways they could never imagine. Then, one bright Saturday morning, the test arrived. Vivi suggested they meet at a quaint cafe near the city center, a place where the sunlight poured through large windows and soft music filled the air. Taye arrived early, as he always did, carrying his quiet calm like a shield against the chaos of the world. Vivi arrived moments later, her face lighting up with a smile that made his chest tighten with warmth. They had just begun laughing over a small mishap with her coffee when the doors of the cafe swung open. Reginald and Margaret, her parents, had arrived unexpectedly. They had spotted their daughter from their car and decided to check in, but their presence was anything but benign. Their eyes fell on Taye, and in that instant, disdain and judgment filled the room. Reginald approached first, his voice sharp and full of authority. "Vivi, what on earth are you doing sitting here with him?" His words were heavy with accusation. Taye stood politely, acknowledging him with a calm nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he said quietly. Reginald scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, do you know who you're speaking to? You have no business being here laughing with my daughter. People like you," he paused, choosing his words like weapons, "shouldn't be anywhere near her, let alone pretending to be equals." "I know exactly what you're after." Margaret leaned in, her tone icy. "You think you can just take advantage of our daughter? Do you think wealth can be fooled? That respect can be demanded from someone who clearly has no place here?" Taye remained calm, silent, dignified. He did not argue, did not insult, and did not raise his voice. He simply recognized that words would not change the minds of those so entrenched in prejudice. Without a word, he collected his coat, nodded politely to Vivi, and walked out of the cafe, leaving her frozen, heartbroken, and powerless. Vivi sat in silence, staring at the empty chair where he had been. She had wanted to speak, to defend him, to tell her parents he was honorable, kind, and sincere, but fear and the weight of their authority had kept her silent. The consequences of that silence were immediate and painful. After Taye left the cafe, the sound of the door closing behind him echoed in the quiet street like a final punctuation mark. For a moment he simply stood there, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions churning inside. The humiliation weighed heavily on him. Every word Reginald and Margaret had said replayed in his mind. The accusations, the disdain, the assumption that he was only after money, they stung deeper than he had expected. When he returned to his small apartment, he closed the door behind him and allowed himself a moment of raw vulnerability. He sank into his chair, shoulders slumping, and let the tears come. For a man who had always carried himself with quiet dignity, this was the first time he openly wept over an injustice done not just to him, but to the integrity of his character. I won't be one of them," he whispered to himself, voice trembling. "I won't let their ignorance, their prejudice define me. I'll show them, I'll show myself what I'm truly worth." No one will ever make me feel small like this again." His hands clenched into fists as determination began to replace despair. That night, Taye lay awake, thinking of every opportunity, every skill he could master, every way he could rise above, not just for himself, but for his dignity. The humiliation he felt that day became the spark for his future, a quiet fire that would drive him to work harder, learn faster, and achieve more than anyone could imagine. Meanwhile, Vivi had been escorted home by her parents in silence at first. Reginald's hand rested heavily on the steering wheel, his jaw tight with frustration, while Margaret's eyes flashed with disapproval. Once they entered the grand foyer of their home, the confrontation began in earnest. "Vivi, what were you thinking?" Reginald demanded, pacing the marble floors. "Sitting there laughing with that man. Do you have any idea how inappropriate that is? People like him have no place in your world, and yet here you are, encouraging him," Margaret added, her voice sharp but controlled. "Do you not understand the risk you're taking, the embarrassment you're bringing upon this family? How could you let yourself fraternize with someone so beneath you?" Vivi stood quietly for a moment, her head bowed slightly, listening, absorbing their words without immediately reacting. She had been raised to respect authority, to value politeness above all else, and even in moments of anger, she had learned to speak thoughtfully. Finally, she lifted her head, her voice calm but firm. "I understand your concerns and I respect your perspective," she began. "But I also know that Taye is a good person. He is kind, honest, and honorable. I appreciate him for who he is, not for what he has or what he could take from us. I cannot change who he is or what he has endured, but I can choose to see his character as it truly is." Her parents exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Vivi, you don't understand," Reginald said sharply. "People like him. They are dangerous to your reputation. You can't just ignore that." "I am not ignoring it," Vivi replied gently, her tone unwavering. "I am choosing to judge him fairly based on what I know, not what assumptions others make. I will not belittle someone for being different from us. I will not let fear of judgment dictate my friendships or my choices." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and Reginald let out a frustrated sigh. "You think you're so mature," he muttered. But even as he spoke, a flicker of hesitation crossed his eyes. Vivi's measured, respectful words had not been defiance. They had been an appeal to reason, to fairness, and that had a subtle power they could not easily dismiss. Later that night, Vivi sat by her window, looking out at the city lights, her thoughts drifting to Taye. She wished she had spoken up in the cafe, that she had defended him when her parents humiliated him publicly. She knew she had acted with manners, with respect, but she also knew that in that moment, she had remained silent in the face of injustice. The weight of that silence pressed on her chest, and she felt a quiet sorrow for the man who had shown her so much kindness, and whom she had failed to protect across the city. Taye sat in his room staring at the ceiling, replaying every word that had been said, every glance that had betrayed prejudice. The tears that had fallen earlier had dried, replaced by a simmering resolve. He would rise above this. He would not allow humiliation or prejudice to define him. Every obstacle, every slight, every unfair judgment would become a stepping stone, a reason to push harder, to achieve more. He whispered to himself again, a vow made to the quiet night. "I will not be small. I will not be defeated by their ignorance. I will become more than they ever imagined, and I will do it on my terms." In those moments of pain and reflection, both Taye and Vivi began to change. Taye's character was hardened with resolve and determination, laying the foundation for the man he would become, a man of power, integrity, and success. Vivi, though filled with guilt and longing, began to understand the complexities of human judgment, the courage it takes to stand for what is right, and the importance of observing someone's true character before accepting the opinions of others. Though the world had dealt them both blows, it also set the stage for growth, resilience, and the eventual reunion that fate had quietly begun to prepare. And in the quiet of their separate lives, both Taye and Vivi held on to the hope that one day, the injustices of the past could give way to understanding, respect, and perhaps a love that could endure anything. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable cafe incident, and life had carried Vivi into the heart of her parents' business empire. Though her days were filled with meetings, reports, and endless responsibilities, a quiet emptiness lingered in her chest. She had tried to distract herself with work, but every time she passed a quiet street or saw a small act of kindness, her thoughts inevitably drifted back to Taye. It was on one of those days, crisp and bright, that she was handed a project she had been waiting for, an opportunity to lead negotiations with a major corporation, a deal so large it could redefine her parents' company. Her preparation was meticulous. Every slide, every projection, every point was calculated to perfection. She practiced her pitch countless times, memorized potential questions, and envisioned herself navigating the negotiations with precision. When she arrived at the conference room, her breath caught. The CEO of the other company, the man responsible for reviewing her proposal, was none other than Taye. Sitting at the head of the sleek, polished table, he exuded a calm authority that immediately set the tone for the meeting. His posture was impeccable, his suit perfectly tailored, and his expression unreadable. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, were cool and distant. There was no warmth, no recognition, only the professional demeanor of a man who had risen far beyond the world that had once humiliated him. The room was filled with other executives, their presence a quiet hum in the background, but to Vivi, they were almost invisible. Every word Taye spoke, every question he posed, carried weight. His voice was firm, controlled, and deliberate, cutting through her carefully prepared presentation. He asked detailed questions about market projections, financial stability, and strategic risks, challenging her assumptions with piercing accuracy. Yet, despite the intensity, he never once glanced at her. Each time their eyes met, she saw the deliberate distance he maintained, a reminder of the past, of the humiliation he had endured, and of the silence she had kept when it mattered most. Vivi presented her proposal flawlessly, her voice steady despite the growing tension in her chest. She responded to every inquiry, offered clarifications, and maintained composure as Taye's questions grew sharper and more exacting. She could feel the judgment in his posture, the silent evaluation of her every word, and a pang of regret twisted deep inside her. She had expected anger or confrontation, but his cold professionalism was far more powerful, far more painful. As the meeting drew to a close, it became clear that Taye would not approve the deal. Despite the thoroughness of her presentation, the other company would not move forward. The executives exchanged quiet murmurs, calculating next steps. But to Vivi, the disappointment of the rejected deal barely registered. The real loss she felt was the same as it had been for months, the distance between them, the wall of dignity and pain that Taye had built around himself. After the room emptied, Vivi hesitated, then gathered her courage and approached Taye. Her voice, gentle but hesitant, broke the silence. "Taye, He did not turn to face her. His posture remained rigid, his expression unreadable. "Vivi," he said quietly but firmly, "you need to stay away from me. For your own sake, for your reputation, and for the choices your parents made that day in the cafe. I cannot allow myself to be connected to someone who let their family humiliate me without a word of defense." She reached out slightly, a hand trembling with a mixture of fear, regret, and longing, but he did not look at her. He simply turned and walked away, leaving her frozen in place. The echo of his footsteps lingered in the room long after he had disappeared, and Vivi felt a weight settle over her chest. She was not thinking about the deal that had been rejected, or the potential loss her family would face. All she could feel was the absence of the man she had come to care for so deeply. Her legs felt heavy as she made her way back to her office. The bustling floor, the chatter of colleagues, the constant movement around her, all of it blurred into a dull haze. She sank into her chair and rested her head on her folded arms, letting the tears she had held back finally fall. This was not anger at the world, nor disappointment in herself. It was grief. Grief for a connection that had been so promising, so genuine, and yet had been severed by circumstance, prejudice, and silence. Hours passed unnoticed. Vivi remained at her desk long after her colleagues had left, staring blankly at the city lights that shimmered through the windows. The rejection of the deal, the financial implications, the strategic setbacks, all of it felt secondary, almost meaningless. What consumed her was the cold, deliberate distance in Taye's eyes, the unspoken words between them, and the realization that months of longing, hope, and unexpressed affection could not bridge the chasm that had opened between them. For Taye, the meeting had been equally taxing, though in a different way. Each question he had asked, each evaluation he had made, was done with a precise mixture of professionalism and subtle judgment. He had maintained his composure, his authority, and his dignity. But every answer Vivi gave reminded him of what had been lost, of the trust she had failed to protect, and of the integrity he had fought to preserve. Walking out of the room, he felt a quiet satisfaction that he had remained true to himself, but also a lingering sadness for what could have been. That evening, as he returned to his apartment, Taye reflected on the meeting. The cold distance he had maintained was not cruelty. It was a necessary shield, a way to protect his dignity and assert the value of his integrity. He had achieved much since that day in the cafe, yet the emotional wound remained, a reminder of how far he had come and how much he had endured. It was also a reminder of the principle he had long held: respect must be earned, and silence in the face of injustice cannot be forgotten. Vivi, meanwhile, sat in her office long after the building had emptied, the city lights casting long shadows across her desk. She had hoped to reach him, to explain, to bridge the distance, but the words she wanted to say felt inadequate against the silent judgment she had seen in his eyes. Her heart ached with the awareness that the path to redemption, both for herself and for their potential connection, would be long and fraught with difficulty. And yet, even in that despair, a quiet seed of hope remained. She knew that Taye's coldness was not the absence of feeling, but a shield forged from pain and principle. She also knew, deep down, that if fate allowed, the distance between them could one day be bridged. Until then, she sat quietly, letting the weight of her grief and longing settle, preparing herself for the challenges and revelations that were yet to come. After leaving the meeting, Taye walked through the quiet streets, the city's hum muted by the weight pressing on his chest. The words he had spoken to Vivi lingered in his mind, echoing with unintended cruelty. "You need to stay away from me," he had said firmly, deliberately, to protect both himself and, in a way, her. But now, away from the scrutiny of the room and the presence of others, the magnitude of his own emotions hit him with an unexpected force. He stopped at the edge of a small park, the streetlights casting soft pools of light across the pavement. For a long moment, he simply stood, silent, letting the cool evening air brush against his face. In his mind, images of Vivi flooded him, her eyes, wide with surprise when he didn't glance at her, her gentle, respectful voice, the warmth she carried effortlessly. A pang of regret tightened in his chest. He had pushed her away, yes, but he had also wanted to protect himself from the lingering wound of humiliation he had endured months ago. Sitting on a bench beneath a tree, he buried his face in his hands. "Why does it hurt this much?" he whispered to himself. "I told her to stay away, yet I can't stop thinking about her." The confession felt heavy and raw, a crack in the armor he had spent so long building. He remembered the laughter they had shared, the quiet moments of connection, and the simple joy of walking beside her through the city streets. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he murmured. I couldn't let my dignity be trampled again, not by anyone, even someone I care about. I had to protect myself, but God, it feels like I've lost more than I've gained." He let out a long, shuddering sigh, feeling the exhaustion of months of restraint and careful planning. The ambition that had driven him, the determination to rise above the humiliation he had faced, suddenly felt heavier. Success mattered, but so did her presence. And the knowledge that he had kept her at a distance weighed on him in a way no obstacle, no business challenge ever had. Taye leaned back on the bench, staring at the night sky. The city lights reflected in his eyes, but it wasn't the gleam of victory he usually saw when contemplating his goals. It was a glimmer of longing, a quiet ache that reminded him how deeply he had cared for her. Even as he had maintained his cold exterior in the meeting, even as he had rejected her silently, he knew that the feelings he had tried to suppress were still very much alive. I wish she could understand," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I wish she knew why I had to do this, why I couldn't just let things be easy." He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady, aching rhythm of his heart. The truth was undeniable. He cared for her, more than he could allow himself to admit aloud. And the very act of keeping his distance was both a shield and a wound. Hours passed, and when he finally returned to his apartment, Taye sat alone in the quiet, reflecting on the delicate balance between pride, principle, and feeling. He understood that love and respect were intertwined with the choices people made when confronted with injustice. He had made a choice, a painful, necessary one, but that choice had consequences, and he would carry them with him until the right time came to confront them. And yet, even as he considered the future, even as he reminded himself that the world would judge him by the color of his skin and the assumptions of others, he could not stop thinking about Vivi, her laughter, her sincerity, the quiet strength of her convictions. They haunted him, not as a distraction, but as a reminder that some connections, some bonds, were too meaningful to simply let go. In that silence, Taye's resolve deepened. He would continue to rise, to work tirelessly, to build a life where dignity and achievement were his alone to define. But he also knew, in the quiet corners of his heart, that Vivi's presence, her kindness and understanding, remained a part of him he could never erase. And though he could not yet bridge the distance between them, he carried the hope, quiet, unspoken, that one day their paths might cross again under different circumstances, when the wounds of the past could finally be healed. Weeks passed, and the failed deal still lingered in the minds of Reginald and Margaret. The financial loss had been significant, and whispers within their company hinted at lost opportunities, strategic setbacks, and mounting pressure. They had been so confident, so certain of their judgment, yet the reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. The man they had humiliated months ago, Taye, was not only intelligent and capable, he was the very authority that had now rejected their proposal. Reginald paced his office late one evening, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on him. "Margaret, we misjudged him," he admitted, voice tight. "We humiliated him in front of our daughter. And now look at what's happened. He's the one who holds the power, not us. We've underestimated him in every way." Margaret sat in silence, staring at the floor. I didn't want to believe it," she murmured. I thought we were protecting Vivi, but all we did was shame a good man. A man who deserved respect." Finally, they made a decision. They would go to Taye to apologize and attempt to repair the damage. It was a humbling step, but one they could no longer avoid. They arrived at his company headquarters, a sleek building that exuded professionalism and authority. As they entered the lobby, they felt an unfamiliar apprehension. They were about to face the man they had scorned, the same man they had dismissed and humiliated months ago. When Taye emerged from his office, impeccably dressed and carrying the calm authority that had become his signature, they were struck silent. He was no longer the quiet, middle-class man they had seen at the cafe. He was the CEO, commanding respect, radiating confidence and competence. Their previous assumptions and prejudices crumbled in an instant under the weight of his presence. "Taye," Reginald began, voice hesitant, struggling for the right words. We owe you an apology. We acted poorly, wrongly. We misjudged you and your character. Please forgive us." Taye studied them carefully, his expression calm but guarded. "I hear your words," he said slowly. "But forgiveness is not freely given. Words cannot erase the past or undo the choices that were made. Actions must accompany sincerity." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We are willing to make amends," she said. Anything you ask of us, we will do." Taye's gaze shifted subtly, measured and deliberate. "Then there is one condition," he said, his voice firm. "Your daughter must join my company. If she wishes to continue involvement in this business, if you wish to restore the deal and salvage what was lost, she will work here under my guidance. No exceptions." There was a pause, a tension that seemed to stretch endlessly. Reginald's pride flared briefly, but the weight of their financial losses, the recognition of their error, and the undeniable authority of Taye left them with no choice. They nodded reluctantly, acknowledging his terms. When Vivi was informed of the decision, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness filled her chest. Walking into Taye's office for the first time under these new circumstances, she felt a rush of emotions: guilt, hope, longing, and a quiet nervousness. Taye was seated behind his desk, reviewing reports with the same calm precision that had characterized him for months. As she approached, his eyes remained fixed on the documents before him. There was no glance, no smile, no recognition at first. He looked up briefly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, then returned his attention to the papers. Vivi's heart sank slightly, but she understood. His coldness was a reflection not of absence of feeling, but of the principle and dignity he had fought to protect. I'm here to start working, she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm inside. Very well, he replied, his tone measured. Remember, this is a professional environment. Respect and competence are paramount. I expect nothing less. Days turned into weeks as Vivi adapted to her new role. At first, the distance between them remained, each interaction careful, deliberate, and professional. Taye remained a figure of authority, commanding the respect of all around him, and Vivi respected his boundaries. Yet gradually the walls began to crumble. Their collaboration on projects, strategic discussions, and shared problem-solving allowed glimpses of the man she had admired, the Taye who was kind, principled, and deeply thoughtful, to shine through. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging meeting, Vivi finally found the courage to speak. Taye, I want to apologize again, she said quietly. For that day in the cafe, for not speaking up, for everything. I should have defended you. Taye looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since their reunion, there was a subtle warmth in his expression. I understand, he said calmly. What matters now is what we do from here, not the past. You've come a long way to be here, and that shows me your integrity. Later, as the company celebrated a successful deal she had helped navigate, Vivi approached him again, her curiosity finally overcoming hesitation. Taye, how did you become so successful? How did you get here? A rare, genuine smile crossed his face. I was humiliated. People underestimated me. I was judged for who I am, for where I come from, for the color of my skin. But I didn't let that define me. I worked tirelessly, 18 hours a day, every day. Every setback became motivation. Every insult became fuel. I built this not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that my worth was never defined by anyone else. Vivi's eyes filled with tears. She understood now. His strength, his dignity, his rise to power had been forged in fire, tempered by pain and strengthened by principle. And in that moment, standing side by side, their hands brushing slightly, a quiet understanding passed between them. Taye reached out, gently taking her hand. Some things are worth waiting for, he said softly. And some bonds are too strong to be broken. Vivi smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in months. I never stopped hoping, she whispered. And there, in the quiet glow of the office lights, with the city sprawling endlessly outside, they allowed themselves to believe in the possibility of love, redemption, and a future built together. The pain of the past had shaped them, but it would not define them. Together, they had risen, stronger, wiser, and ready to face the world hand in hand. After the parents left Taye's office, humbled and apologetic, Vivi finally allowed herself to breathe. The tension that had shadowed her for months seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a cautious hope. She walked beside Taye as they left the boardroom, their steps measured but side by side. He glanced at her briefly this time, a faint softness in his eyes. I hope you understand why I had to remain distant, he said quietly. I do, she replied, her voice steady but gentle. And I've learned I'll never underestimate the weight of integrity or the courage it takes to protect oneself. For a moment, the world felt still around them. No words were needed. Months of longing, guilt, and admiration hung silently between them. Later, as they settled into their work together at his company, Vivi finally asked the question that had been on her mind since their reunion. How did you become all of this? A CEO, a force like this? Taye smiled, a mixture of pride and humility. I was humiliated, underestimated, and dismissed. I worked 18-hour days, faced every obstacle, and refused to let anyone define my worth. Every struggle became a step toward this. Vivi's eyes shimmered with understanding. "I never doubted you," she said softly. "I only wish I'd realized sooner how strong you really were." He reached for her hand, their fingers entwining naturally. "Some things are worth waiting for," he murmured. "And some bonds are impossible to break." The city lights outside reflected in their eyes, and for the first time in months, the weight of past prejudice, silence, and heartbreak felt like a distant memory. Together, they had endured, grown, and finally, found a way to be with one another, stronger, wiser, and ready to face the future.